To our panel, Dr. Andrew Murrison is a Conservative MP and former Minister. Bill Esterson, Shadow Business and Industry Minister, Labour MP for Sefton Central. Benedict Spence is a journalist and political commentator, writes for all sorts of different publications. And if you're watching us, you can see we have an empty chair on the end. Jo Phillips will be joining us, the writer and broadcaster, but because of the RMT strike, she can't get a cab. But she will be here shortly, I'm assured. So, 0345 6060 973 is the number to call, and of course you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's go to our first caller. It's Tony in Doncaster. Hello, Tony.
Hello, Ian.
Hi, what would you like to ask?
If Russia uses chemical weapons against the population of Ukraine, would NATO still be justified in standing back?
Well, they have apparently been using illegal weapons already, I think I'm right in saying. Andrew Murrison, this is a really difficult one, isn't it, for NATO? If that happened, I mean, if chemical weapons were used, and let's face it, we know that Putin has used chemical weapons in this country, let alone in Ukraine, what do you think NATO's response should be?
Well, we know that, Ian, in fact, in Salisbury, which is very close to my constituency and where I live. So this is quite raw for people who have experience of Novichok in Wiltshire. But be clear. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and I think we've been quite clear. All governments have been clear that this is not something that NATO should be involved in directly. That's to say, boots on the ground. That's been ruled out. We're talking about a hypothetical. I doubt Putin will deploy those sorts of weapons. And if he did, I think what we've been seeing over the past few hours and days, that is to say, people's just general revulsion at what he has done being multiplied. It will be there in spade loads, and I suspect it would be very much the beginning of the end for Putin and his regime.
So I suppose, Bill, we should remember that he was backing President Assad at the time that Assad used chemical weapons in Syria. So do you think that he's got any scruples about using any weapons that might help him gain the victory that he desperately needs?
Well, it's a very important question, and we must hope that he won't do it for the sake of the people of Ukraine and indeed for the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. And this is where Andrew and I are going to agree a lot. I think that we probably...
It's not obligatory, by the way.
Well, we'll do it on this question, which is that the Labour Party fully supports NATO, and Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and NATO won't be intervening. I think actually Andrew made a very good point, which is we must hope that at some point this really is the beginning of the end for Putin, already in what he's done in invading and in certainly breaking international law, the horrendous attack that he's already launched against the Ukrainian people. That should be the beginning of the end for him.
I detect in the last couple of days a little bit of a shift in public opinion in this country towards using force. And it reminds me of the days back in 2003 when there were a lot of people who were very gung-ho about the war in Iraq, and those very same people very quickly forgot how gung-ho they were and now make out that they were against it right from the start. How important, Benedict Spence, is public opinion here in either helping or hindering governments making decisions?
This might sound a little bit controversial. It shouldn't really play a part at all. Actually, this is the time for cold calculation and rational assessment of the situation. Yes, we may all be feeling very sort of visceral about what's happening in Ukraine. What's happening in Ukraine is awful, but the fact remains, Ukraine, as has been said, is not in NATO. We had many opportunities to try to expedite the process of bringing it into NATO or the European Union in the past. We didn't. We should have known that this was a serious threat. Clearly, we didn't take that threat seriously enough. And now I'm afraid we have to live with the consequences of that indecision, if you like. Ukraine is a lot closer than a place like Iraq. And, even at the time we had people talking about, well, Saddam may or may not have the capability of weapons of mass destruction in 45 minutes. Well, we all know that Vladimir Putin not only has weapons of mass destruction, but we know for a fact that he's got, hypersonic missiles that can travel at between Mach 5 and Mach 10. That's not deployed in 45 minutes. That is wherever you want in the world in 45 minutes. It's a very different situation. And as upsetting as it is, as difficult as it is, we do need to continue to send aid where we can. We need to send medical aid. We need to look very seriously about the refugee situation, all sorts of little things that we can do. But the actual question of NATO intervention right now, I'm afraid, is off the table. And that is because of NATO and Ukrainian indecision in the past about whether or not it wanted to be a member of the alliance.
But what if chemical weapons were used?
They were used in Syria, they've been used in Libya, they've been used in all kinds of places, and NATO has not necessarily intervened in the way that we are talking about now. It doesn't matter, actually, that this is in Europe, that this is, that this is very close to us. We had a decision to make. Ukraine had a decision to make whether or not it joined NATO, and it is too late for that. If we get involved, if things escalate, we shouldn't actually, think about things as we often do in this country. The threat of nuclear war, it's just on the horizon. It's not going to happen. A bit like we thought about the pandemic. Yes, we're overdue for one, but it's not actually going to happen. We don't need to worry about it. Vladimir Putin is not a Western liberal politician. He doesn't have qualms about using nuclear weapons. He doesn't get asked those questions. It's taken as read.
But we did, or the Americans did, backed by France and Britain, intervene in Syria when chemical weapons were used. Syria clearly not a member of NATO.
The Assad regime did not have nuclear weapons. Now, the Russians may well have been an ally of Bashar al-Assad, but actually we didn't intervene against Russia in that conflict. Russian mercenaries, Russian-backed mercenaries, yes, that's a very different thing from the Russian military. And let's be very clear here. That is what we're talking about. Any sort of, whether you want to talk about it in terms of a no-fly zone or peacekeeping, it involves engaging Russian forces. That's a declaration of war.
What about the idea of maybe non-NATO jets or fighters being used by Ukraine, being lent by other countries that aren't members of... to pick one at random, if South Africa, I think, has quite a well-developed air force. If South Africa decided that they were so outraged by what Russia had done that they wanted to lend, say, a dozen fighters to... as I'm saying this, it sounds preposterous, and you're looking at me as if it's preposterous, Andrew, but this is being seriously suggested now.
Well, to be clear, the UK and others have provided Ukraine with the wherewithal to defend themselves far better than would otherwise be the case.
But sending anti-tank missiles is a bit different from sending a fighter.
Anti-tank missiles are very important, and the ability to destroy Putin's effort on the ground is vitally important, and we've seen this convoy heading for Kiev being interrupted, slowed down, retarded. Part of that, I am certain, is because we have provided him with the material needed to do that. In terms of what might then be provided, and it comes to aircraft's crucial, this issue of no-fly zones, what we have to be absolutely clear about is backing Putin into a corner, which may oblige him, in his fevered imagination, to deploy even worse weapons, particularly since it looks as if large chunks of his military at the moment are not doing what he is telling them to do, and discipline and morale is breaking down. If he perceives that to be the case, if he perceives his columns going into major Ukraine cities to be ineffective, he'll look for other things to do of the sort you have described.
Right, let's Tony, thank you for that. Let's move on to another question. It's on a similar subject from James in High Wycombe. James, hi, go ahead.
Yes, hi there, yes. What I'm wondering is Joe Biden afraid of Putin? Now, if he is, that's a very serious situation that we're in. And if he's not afraid, then shouldn't he do something about him? Stand up to him.
Bill Esterson.
Well, I suspect that we're all afraid of Putin, and in that sense, Joe Biden is no different, and afraid with good reason, because we have a very dangerous man in charge of a very large arsenal, who's confounded people who thought he would never invade Ukraine, although, as I think people should be reminded, he invaded them in 2014.
I have lost count of the number of so-called experts, military, political commentators, who were all absolutely convinced that he wouldn't invade Ukraine. And somebody like me, who is not a military expert, you can see it coming a mile off.
Well, I had the same conversations, including early last week with people who were sure it wouldn't happen. But Joe Biden is head of the largest contributor to NATO. NATO is standing united. We have put forces collectively on the NATO border and are, as NATO countries, helping to supply the Ukrainian army, as Andrew was telling us. I mean, just to go back to the point about aircraft, my understanding was that there are European countries who are helping to supply aircraft that the Ukrainian Air Force can use. I seem to remember that was a few days ago. We quickly forget these things. So I think there is a lot of supplying going on. But Joe Biden's position is to be as supportive of the Ukrainians as the rest of us, and I think that's the job he's doing.
Benedict?
I mean, that's the key thing, isn't it? If you're not afraid of Vladimir Putin, you're not doing your job right, especially if you are the President of the United States.
There's nothing wrong with being afraid of him.
There's nothing. There's no shame in it.
If he is becoming a little bit unhinged, which a lot of people are saying, you should be very afraid of what he might do.
Well, you're afraid if he's unhinged, afraid if he's rational, because if he's thinking competently, then actually, the next step, certainly in Russia's military calculus, would be to escalate things, and that is equally sort of terrifying. I mean, the question of whether or not he can do something about it, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about a nuclear strike on Moscow? Are we talking about an assassination? What are we talking about here? Right now, from what I see, the economic sanctions, the physical sanctions that are being placed, the pressure that's being exerted on the Russian people, the Russian economy, and the fact that we are supplying weapons, in whatever quantities that we can. That, I think, right now is possibly the best situation, given, as you say, that there is not there's not consensus, actually, that the Russian military is operating as it should be. It's not doing as badly as it's being made out, but it's not certainly, as slick an operation as Putin would hope it would be. You are hoping that there will be dissent in the ranks, and that, enough pressure can be brought to bear on the regime that he is, if you like, sort of ushered out of the door. But I'm afraid that is also a very dangerous situation, because for Vladimir Putin, we talk about this conflict being existential for Ukraine, which it is. It's also existential for Vladimir Putin. Anything less than success is humiliation. And that doesn't mean he goes, and he lives in his dacha for the rest of in political failure. It doesn't mean he gets to go into exile anywhere. It means he dies. Let's be very clear about this. So he is going to be very motivated to cling on for as long as he can. And this is when we talk about, Russia needing to be defeated. There are incredibly nasty scenarios where Russia loses, and actually there ends up being a sort of an internal power struggle in Russia with, as we've established, not very nice elements, political elements in Russia, a lot of, very disillusioned soldiers, a lot of very disillusioned people, and an awful lot of weapons sloshing around in that country. It is not simply a case of, if you get rid of him, it'll all be fine.
I mean, I don't know if we'll have a question on this later, but all this talk about crushing the Russian economy, you do that and you could end up with a failed state. And as you say, who knows what the results of that might be. Andrew, what's your answer to this question? Is Biden afraid of Putin?
Well, he should be. We're all, at one level or another, afraid of Putin. He's a powerful man. But let's just remember, he's only one part of a regime. And we should draw some comfort in that others within that regime need to know that their card is being marked. And the comments that have been made recently about the fact we are watching, we are writing, and ultimately you will be apprehended and you will be called to account. Russians, Belarusians, anybody who is complicit in this atrocity will be brought to account. There will be no stone under which they will be able to crawl and hide. They will be found out and they will be dealt with. And I think as this goes on, and if, as I hope it will, it continues to go badly for Putin, there will be some minds being very much concentrated on the next step. And those close to Putin, I think, are going to have to be thinking very carefully about what they do and the fact that they will individually be held to account for what they're doing.
Now, we could spend the whole of the programme talking about Ukraine, and we may well do, but it is entirely up to you. If you want to phone in on anything else, you could phone in on the RMT strike. You could phone in on MP's pay, whatever you like. 0345 6060 973. Andrew and Bill saying, please don't phone in on MP's pay. It's 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
Give
Ask Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
It's 8:20 on LBC. With me on the panel are Dr. Andrew Murrison, Conservative MP, and what's your constituency, remind me?
South West Wiltshire.
How could I forget that? I'll write it down now so I say it next time. And former Defence Minister Jo Phillips hopefully will be here, but she's stuck in traffic because of the wretched tube strike. Benedict Spence is journalist and political commentator, and Bill Esterson is a Shadow Business and Industry Minister and Labour MP for Sefton Central. Iain is in Harefield. Hello, Iain.
Hi. I just wanted to know what the panel thinks. What would the best be that Boris could actually have achieved from his visit to Europe? Surely it would have been better if he could have gone to the United Nations and persuaded the UN, not NATO, but the UN, to create a peacekeeping no-fly zone over Ukraine. So that it wouldn't be about NATO versus Russia. It would be about keeping peace in Ukraine. And of course, NATO could then contribute to that.
Well, there's two problems with that. First of all, we have a UN ambassador whose job it is to do things like that. But the second problem is that Russia is on the Security Council and would veto any UN involvement in this at all. And my colleagues may disagree. But Benedict Spence, Boris Johnson has been in Poland and Estonia today. Was that time well spent?
Ultimately, I think it's more important that he's in places like Poland and Estonia and Slovakia and the other countries bordering it, offering support, visibly showing that there is support and that we aren't afraid we're not going to draw back, than trying to persuade countries that might have the military capacity to intervene against Russia but aren't going to. You know, China is wholly disinterested in getting into any kind of peacekeeping mission with Russia, as is India, as is Pakistan, as are countries like Iran, not just because they might lose and they have no real dog in this fight, but also because they rely fundamentally on the key tenets of the Russian economy, be that fertilizer, be that fuel, be it wheat. You know, the Kenyan ambassador to the UN made a really powerful speech a couple of days ago saying that all African nations that have ever been colonized will sympathize. Well, Kenya imports 40% of its wheat from Russia. It's not anytime soon going to be engaging in any kind of operations that might upset the Kremlin. Imran Khan was in Moscow the day after the invasion took place, and he said it's an exciting time to be here. Why? Because his country is very food insecure and they require Russian exports. So I don't know what you get out of the UN, frankly, you know, a couple of piecemeal things here and there, but it really is Europe and, you know, more widely NATO, and I don't think you can rely on any of these other countries that have too deeper economic and actually defence ties to Moscow, frankly.
Andrew.
Well, the point was made about the no-fly zone, which I think is something that on the face of it looks very attractive. That is to say, no military aircraft in the air. The trouble is you've got to enforce it. That implies some level of military action because Putin isn't simply going to comply with such a thing. And that means shooting down Russian aircraft, and that means war. So clearly that is something that would not be desirable. It would be a massive escalation, and I'm not sure what the end result of that will be. I'm pretty sure my constituents in South West Wiltshire would not be very supportive of us escalating matters to that extent. So I'm afraid we need to nail this idea that everything would be okay if there weren't Russian aircraft flying around the airspace of Ukraine. If we declared a no-fly zone, all would be well. I'm afraid it's just not as simple as that. Was Boris right to be in the Baltic states and Poland? Yes, of course he was, for exactly the reasons that Benedict has just described. It's vitally important that we reassure our friends and allies that are much closer geographically to this than we are of our presence and our ability and willingness, our intent to support them since they are primarily in the front line in this. That does not mean pledging military force in Ukraine. I feel that would be extremely foolhardy. There's absolutely no appetite, political, public, in this country for that.
Iain, thank you for your question. Let's move on to something else now. Alex is in Pimlico. Hi, Alex.
Oh, hello, Iain. I would like to ask panelists about this MP salary. I would like to say, is it fair MP salary rising up to £84,000 a year, and at the same time, millions of people of this country using food banks?
The pay rise, I think, is going to be £2,200, which I think in percentage terms is probably about 3%, which, as we know now, is less than inflation. Bill, do you think that MPs... I mean, this is set independently. This is not you voting on your own salaries, but it's being set by IPSA. Do you think that it's justified? They're saying, well, MPs have had to work extremely hard during the pandemic. Well, a lot of people could say that, couldn't they?
Oh, there's a great many people who've worked extremely hard during the pandemic, Ian. It's that's absolutely right to say, and I pay tribute to the emergency services, the health service, the police, the local government, especially, who often get overlooked, who are not getting these pay rises, and I think they should be, and they should be catching up. But as you say, we don't set our own pay. It's done independently, precisely to avoid these sorts of discussions, and that is exactly as it should be.
Will you be taking it? I have to ask you that question.
Well, we don't have any choice as to whether we take it. What we do with it is another question. I invariably give money locally to good causes, and I will no doubt be doing the same this year.
Andrew?
I support the independent way in which MPs' salaries are determined. We got ourselves into a right mess 10 years ago over the expenses fiasco. It was horrible, dreadful, and it reduced the reputation of politicians just enormously. I don't ever want to go back to that. So I don't want MPs to interfere in this process at all. As I understand it, IPSA, the independent body that sets this, that we've tasked to set this, has pegged this at the average of last year's public sector pay rises. That's my understanding. Will I take it? Yes, Ian, I will.
As Bill said, though, that when it was all delegated to IPSA, it was supposed to stop discussions like this because everyone would think it was all perfectly reasonable for an independent body to set the pay, but that hasn't happened, has it? Every time that they recommend a rise, people are outraged.
There is never a good time to give MPs a pay rise. That's the fundamental problem with this.
Well, let's ask our panellist who isn't an MP. I mean, I've always taken the view that, I mean, most people will think that £84,000 is a huge amount, and compared to what most people earn, it is. But I think the work that politicians do in creating laws, you want to attract the best people into politics. And I've always thought that MPs are drastically underpaid.
Yes, you've taken a bit of my answer.
Oh, sorry,
No, it's fine. It's fine. But this is good. It shows that actually some rationality can prevail.
They can't say that.
They can't say that. And I feel very sorry for them because they're sat there going, well, if only I could say that. But I do feel very sorry, MPs, because they... Always there's a few idiots and a few loudmouths who give the entire profession a bad name. And, we all understand that we all dislike our MPs. We all want them to live a sort of a monastic existence and, not have any free time, not have any fun. But, yes, it's an incredibly taxing job. It's, you're splitting yourself between two places sort of permanently. Your constituency in Westminster. You work incredibly long hours. You have to be across all kinds of things, especially also if you're a minister or something like that. You also have to deal with your constituency's issues. You have to deal with party issues. You have to deal with government issues if you're so unlucky, or shadow issue. It's just one of those things where you can't ever win. You can't get the PR battle right. And so I do think it's right that it's set independently. It's very unfair that lots of people are, really going through the ringer at the moment because of the pandemic, because of everything that's happening in the wider global economy, not helped, of course, by what's happening in Ukraine. It's very difficult when people aren't going to food banks. It's very difficult when people aren't getting pay rises, when rents are going up, when, it's just generally harder to live. That doesn't mean that everybody needs to suffer universally. And I don't think you're going to encourage MPs to work harder, to improve people's lot in life. If you make their existence fundamentally more difficult, that means that they do need a pay rise as cost of living goes up.
So, just to bring something else into this, the RMT have gone on strike today in protest at their pay and conditions possibly being eroded because the government won't give Sadiq Khan or TfL a long-term deal. We can't really have it both ways, can we? Maybe you lot should go on strike for better terms and conditions. That'd be interesting, wouldn't it?
I don't think there's much appetite for people feeling sorry for MPs for their pay.
I mean, somebody here says public servants did not get a pay rise last year. Don't think MPs did either, did you? Well, if you did, it was quite a small one, I think.
I can't remember being outraged at it, so
No.
it probably didn't happen.
And if you weren't outraged, then no one would be.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Right, we are going to come to more of your calls in a moment. Huge numbers of calls coming into the programme today. Keep them coming. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:30. News headlines with David Dom.
Russia has told people in the Ukrainian capital to leave their homes. Ukraine's president say 5 people have been killed in a strike on a TV tower as Russia's invasion continues. Earlier, a missile strike hit the central square of Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv. President Zelensky told the European Parliament the attack is an act of state terrorism after 10 people were killed. The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, has announced measures to welcome more Ukrainian refugees. British nationals can now bring over a wider group of relatives, but she's again said it'll be a security threat to waive visas entirely. LBC weather, rain moving northwards across England tonight and into Northern Ireland. Dry and clear in Scotland with a low of -2.
This is LBC. Ask Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:34. Andrew Murrison with us, Benedict Spence and Bill Esterson. Joe Phillips has given up, so we're not going to see Joe Phillips, I'm afraid, because the traffic is just too bad. I think she'd have probably got here at 1 minute to 9, which wouldn't really work. Right, let's go to our next caller. It's a text question, actually, from Mary in Camden. So they're finally scrapping the horrible policy that forces care home staff to get vaccines. Why did we ever allow such an infringement on people's rights? Are they scrapping that, Benedict?
I wasn't actually aware that they were scrapping.
No, is this a bit of news that I've missed today? I mean, it's interesting because we were obsessed by COVID.
NHS.
We haven't had COVID.
It's the NHS that's not happening, isn't it?
Yeah, I think Mary, you might have slightly
Or if
got
we
the
missed
wrong
this in the fog of war.
But the principle's the same. So the question is well put, and such a policy needs to be taken, I think, very seriously, because of course there is a real infringement on individuals personally, and unless there's good evidence that it's going to be effective in what you're trying to achieve, which is a reduction in transmission.
Right. Here's the story. It was only an hour ago, so I can be forgiven for not being across it, seeing as I'm on air. Regulations requiring care workers to be vaccinated against COVID are being lifted from the 15th of March in England. The government says things have changed since the policy was made in preparation for a tough autumn and winter. It says the UK population now has lots of immunity to the virus thanks to vaccines, and many people have recently caught and recovered from the Omicron variant, which has been less severe than Delta. Go.
Yeah. So the point is that the evidence has changed, and therefore government policy has changed, which is exactly what I would expect it to do. So there's no point in insisting on people being vaccinated if it's not going to affect materially the amount of transmission that goes on. It simply then becomes an infringement, and furthermore one that's likely to drive away critical care workers. So I think the government is absolutely right to look at the evidence as it stands at the moment and reverse the policy, which is something that a number of my medical MP colleagues have been pressing upon the government for some time. And I'm very pleased they've listened and have changed their stance on this.
Benedict?
Yeah, I apologise for not being across that earlier, but I think that it is the sort of the broader issue is very much, we put a lot of things on hold. We put a lot of aspects of our lives on hold, the economy on hold, for keeping the NHS on its feet. And of course, part of that is the care system, looking after the vulnerable people, the elderly people who may need it at any sort of stage. And it's never really sat particularly well with me, the idea that as we sort of get out the other side of the pandemic, we then put more pressure potentially on care services, health services, by potentially forcing people out of jobs, when actually, the NHS, the care system, has always been, even before the pandemic, was in a pretty parlous state. It wasn't actually doing especially well. So for me, the idea of putting obstacles, I understand earlier on, when there was, we had the Delta variant and it was still early on in the sort of the vaccine take-up. I understand the need to get sort of, as many jabs in the arms and to protect vulnerable people. But as the virus becomes, sort of endemic and it becomes a lot less vicious, ultimately this always had to be the strategy. It couldn't be that you ran a society entirely based on getting jabs for something that we now have much greater immunity for, especially when it comes to keeping your health service on its feet.
Bill?
Yeah, I think there are three elements to this. The first is the point about rights, and there's this balance between the right of someone not to have something put in their body against the right of the person who needs to be protected from them and reduce the risk, especially somebody vulnerable in a care home or indeed in hospital, of contracting COVID. The second point is that the way that the government tried to persuade people. Now, the Welsh government didn't go down this road because they were more successful in persuading people to have the vaccine working in care homes and indeed in the NHS. And then the third thing is now, I think as Andrew and Benedict have both said, we are now at a point where we have much higher protection through vaccination, and it is less of a risk for people, for the residents living in care homes.
Okay, let's go to Natasha in Hackney. Hello, Natasha.
Hi. So why has no one from the government given a special answer or even addressed the factor that they haven't, met their agreement that they made in the Budapest memorandum? It's been brought up many times by the Ukrainian parliament and by their press. But it's just been simply ignored. Do they think it's that easy to sweep it under the carpet?
Just explain what the Budapest memorandum was.
So it was basically to get, I can't remember what year it was, but basically so that Ukraine gave up 60 nuclear. Nuclear.
I think it was 1994.
I was going to say one, but.
Well, it was in the early 1990s, and essentially in return for giving up its nuclear weapons, Ukraine had its borders guaranteed by America, Russia, I think, Britain and France. Andrew, I don't know if you're more of an expert on this than I am, but I think that's the basics of it.
Yes, I mean, the practical reality of this is what do you expect those countries now to do? The first duty they have is not to make the situation even worse. They have all, one way or another, been engaged in sanctions of really quite a severe nature on Russia. And I think they have made the judgment that the best way to try to restore equanimity to the country and the region is to pursue those sanctions rigorously rather than get involved with a conflict on the ground, the end results of which none of us, I'm afraid, can predict and could potentially involve us in a third world war. That would not be a responsible thing to do. It wouldn't serve the people of Ukraine, it wouldn't serve us, and it certainly wouldn't please my constituents.
I've got the details now. It was signed in 1994. It was signed by the three nuclear powers, Russia, United Kingdom and the United States. China and France, it says here, gave somewhat weaker individual assurances in separate documents. So that was the basis of it. I mean, it makes you wonder if, Benedict, if Ukraine hadn't given up its nuclear weapons in 1994, we wouldn't be talking about it probably, because they would have had that deterrent.
Possibly. I mean, I think at the time there was a hope that a post-Soviet Russia sort of emerging into the rest of the world could be persuaded sort of on a path away from imperialism. I think I think that there was a lot of optimism, perhaps naive, lack of understanding of what the nature of a future regime in Moscow would look like, especially with what then went on to happen in places like Chechnya and elsewhere. But nonetheless, I think that you had to sort of go into the sort of the post-Soviet era with optimism as to whether or not what would be happening in Ukraine would be happening if Ukraine still had nuclear weapons. I mean, that's a bit of a difficult one because, of course, at the time, Ukraine didn't have the capacity to operate the nuclear weapon, certainly not against Moscow. But, obvious reasons why you don't want people to have nuclear weapons, whoever it is has access to the codes. Sooner or later, people will, cannibalize them and they'll refigure them or, they'll point them in different directions. So it's certainly a possibility. But again, also, we didn't necessarily know what kind of a government we were going to end up with in Ukraine. We've had very pro-Russian presidents. We've had very pro-European ones. You've got all sorts of questions about Ukrainian nationalism and what direction that could have gone in. It was, at the time, considered, as was the case with other countries, a good thing to have fewer nuclear weapons in the hands of fewer countries. And I don't think that that's a goal that we should say was completely foolish. But nonetheless, there should have been a little bit more, I think, reality, a realpolitik hard-headedness about this, certainly as the years went by, and certainly what happened in Chechnya, in Georgia, actually before what happened in Donbass and Crimea happened. We should perhaps have recognised what was going to happen in Ukraine, and perhaps not, give Ukraine nuclear weapons or anything like that, but the process of inviting it into Ukraine into NATO, putting NATO forces in there, should have been expedited before Vladimir Putin got to a position where he felt confident enough to invade.
Bill?
Well, Natasha's question is about who has reneged on the Budapest Agreement. The people who've reneged on it are Vladimir Putin and what Keir Starmer called his bandits. That's Putin's bandits. And they are the ones who are responsible for the invasion, they and they alone. And I think Andrew is right. We have taken very tough action through sanctions. We can argue about whether we should have done things earlier, but we are in this situation now facing this illegal invasion, and the toughest possible sanctions are being implemented right across the world. And I think there is still some way to go, and perhaps we will come to that in a subsequent question. But we are doing the right things in standing shoulder to shoulder with our allies. We are doing the right things in imposing sanctions in common with the international community. And in that sense, that is how we are doing our best to uphold our signature on the agreement.
Right, we've got a very controversial question coming up next. But first, let's take a break. It's 8:45.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
Jan in Bedford. Jan, you have family in Ukraine?
I wanted to send a simple message to Mr. Putin. People in Ukraine, they won't surrender. I've tried to convince my mum to leave the country. I just stopped convincing her because she said to me, I just want you to know I love you so much and I'm glad you're not here because I have nothing to lose.
So difficult for you, Jan.
Please help us a little bit and then we'll handle the rest. We won't surrender.
No, I don't think you are the sort of people who surrender but it doesn't seem to be the Ukrainian way.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player, LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
It's 8:48. Bill Esterson, Benedict Spence and Andrew Murrison with me answering your calls. Let's go to Simon in Orpington. Hi, Simon.
Hi, yeah, good evening, and good evening to the panel. With everything that's going on and everything that is Vladimir Putin has said, why aren't we thinking about taking him out?
Well, it's a thought. It would probably break every international law that there is. Bill Esterson.
You're quite right, Ian. It would break international law. It would probably unite Russia in taking action against whoever, as Simon puts it, takes him out. And we've already heard of the consequences if we engage militarily with Russia. I think it would be on a much bigger scale than that, and the consequences, well, wouldn't just be Andrew's constituency in Wiltshire. I think mine would be very, very concerned at the prospect. No, I think it would be very dangerous.
I mean, given how long his tables are, I'm not sure anyone could get close enough to him. But Andrew.
Well, I know where Simon's coming from, but the fact of the matter, as Bill has said, it would be contrary to every tenet of international law, would make us to pariahs just like Putin. So I think it would be something that would be reprehensible. I mean, what his own people do with him is entirely a matter for them. But I'm afraid we can't do what is suggested, much as Simon might wish it. And
the problem is that even if someone in Russia did it, they would easily find ways of blaming someone in the West for it, wouldn't they?
Well, I think there's always that. It's very difficult to know exactly what's going on in the Kremlin. But you're right. There's a lot of stuff going on. I suspect that we don't know about a lot of things. And ultimately, what happens? I suspect the end to this, some way or another. Benedict pointed out that none of this probably is going to end well for Putin. But somehow or another, my conviction is it's going to be the Russian people at some level that is going to sort this out, not ourselves.
I mean, let's just take the international law and morality out of the question. The logistics would probably be quite difficult, given that he is just about the most well-guarded person, aside from the leaders of China and North Korea and the President of the United States. It's not something that you can do particularly easy. He's not some former KGB operative living in the English countryside. It would be practically very difficult. And I think also you do need to...
Jack Bauer. Jack Bauer's the one you need, isn't it?
We always talk, don't we, about learning the lessons of history and never again. Well, let's all take ourselves back to the early part of the last century when a giant war was ignited across Europe with the assassination of an individual. These things don't necessarily go the way you want just because somebody you don't like is taken out of the picture. You cannot control the consequences of that.
And as someone says here, Putin is in a command centre, i.e. bunker, under the Ural Mountains. We couldn't get anywhere near him. Simon, thank you for that. A text question from John T. in St John's Wood. What do we do if Putin threatens to launch nuclear weapons if we don't back down? Well, he already has, hasn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, in a way. So what should our response be? Just to sort of ignore it? It's quite difficult to come back with a response to that, isn't it? Andrew?
Well, he's upping the ante, isn't he? But if you were to war game this before this all kicked off, I suspect you would reckon at some point or another he was going to do that one in some way, shape or form. So this should not come as any great surprise to us. I don't think he would, and as I indicated earlier on, he's not the only player in this piece. His regime is there, and there are checks and balances we are assured that would prevent him doing such a thing. And again, I come back to the point I made earlier. We have to make it crystal clear to everybody in the regime that we are watching and we are writing down what they are doing, and they will be held to account ultimately, personally, individually for what they do. Everybody in this horrible mix will be held to account.
Bill?
Well, you have to hope that there are people in his regime who will stop him using nuclear weapons. And yes, he has already more or less threatened this, hasn't he? More than once, in fact. And that's got to be the way to look at it. He's not the only person involved, and I mean, ultimately, somebody in the military, somebody in his close circle, or some bodies in his close circle are going to have to intervene. And I said earlier, this has to be the beginning of the end for Putin. That will happen ultimately through internal change. The reaction of the Russian people, I think we've already seen significant demonstrations by some very brave people in Russia who've come out on the streets in a number of cities, faced brutal repression by the authorities. And we must hope that what the Russian public are experiencing does feed through, and Andrew's right actually to remind those around Putin that they will be held accountable to this, and in the end they are the ones who must act.
Benedict?
The first thing to remember is, when we're talking about the threat of nuclear weapons, that doesn't mean that he's going to launch rockets at London and Washington and Los Angeles and places like that. There are different degrees of nuclear weapons, strategic.
I think he wants to launch one on Liz Truss, doesn't he?
Yeah, particularly Liz Truss. Doesn't joins the people, the fan club of people that don't actually like Liz Truss. I can never understand why that was. It seemed rather unthreatening to me, but that's beside the point. As I say, there are different sort of grades of nuclear weapon that can be used, none of which are good. Let's be very clear. There's no such thing as a good nuclear weapon. But what are we talking about here? Are we talking about an attack on a civilian population? Are we talking about an attack on a military installation? There are different degrees of ramping up the tension, and there are different degrees of then using these weapons. And I think we have to be very careful about saying, if Vladimir Putin, launches a small nuclear attack on, say, an airbase inside Ukraine, does that mean then we go hell for leather and we respond with everything that we have? No. And again, it requires calm heads in that situation to say, because Let us be very clear, it's not all talk. We are closer now to nuclear war than we have been, since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And again, I think people don't necessarily understand how close we were even then. And there is no coming back from this. There's no sort of looking back and learning from it, picking up the pieces. That's not to say you stand down and you let him have Ukraine or anything like that. It does require a lot of staring in the eyes, holding your nerve, and not actually doing anything completely irrational. And recognising that actually, if he is, as I believe, not completely mad, a rational man, he does not want nuclear destruction for himself either, or his people, and neither do the people in his regime. Escalation to the point of then, with the intent of having de-escalation afterwards, it is something that I think is probably going to happen. As you've said, weapons have been put on high alert, they've been manoeuvred, they're not at the highest level of alert yet, but I do think we will hear more of this rhetoric. It's very important that we are not seen to be the ones to push it over the edge.
Right, let's have a final question on something a bit different from James in Enfield. Why, oh why, are the tube workers allowed to completely destroy London's infrastructure like they have done today? Bill?
We live in a democracy. People have the right to strike. I don't think the phrase destroy London's infrastructure is exactly as I would describe it, but I have every sympathy for London commuters. And I don't think that this is the way to take forward what I think is a good case. The real culprit here is government that's not funding London transport properly, that haven't recognised the realities of the serious fall in revenue that happened as a result of the pandemic. Indeed,
well, they've given TfL 5 bailouts. What more should they have been doing?
Well, if you want to keep a London transport system going, you have to keep it going when you've got 2 years with very, very little revenue for significant parts of it, Iain, is the answer to that. Sadiq Khan was getting the budget deficit down. He was doing an extremely good job of controlling the finances of London Underground and London Transport, but that wasn't possible with the pandemic and the consequences for revenues. Before anybody says differently, as Sean Bailey did in the mayoral election. But I don't think this is the way forward, and I think we need the government to fund and recognise the reality.
So give in to the strikers, basically?
No, it's not about giving in to the strikers, but it is about recognising the reality and funding properly, and then you're in a different discussion, a different negotiation. It goes back to what we were saying earlier about pay, doesn't it, and making sure that people are paid properly.
Tube drivers, on average, earn between £60,000 and £65,000, which I think most people would give an arm and a leg for.
Yes.
It's like more than twice the national average earnings, and no one's suggesting that their pay should be cut. So why? How can it be justified for them to put Londoners at this huge inconvenience only a few weeks after most people have actually gone back to using the tube?
Well, as I said, I don't think this is the way to go
Benedict.
forward.
This might sound a little bit harsh, but as with all trains in the UK, driverless trains can't arrive fast enough. I think that is the way that this is going to go, ultimately. I think that a lot of tube drivers probably recognise that. It's not nice, I suppose, if you're a tube driver, but that is the nature of progress. That's the direction that we're going. And, ultimately you can't hold an entire capital, sort of hostage or captive, if you like, when we are all trying to get back to work. We do have very important things we have our lives to be getting on with, and people were late to this program as a result. And now this is not, for example, a key industry or something like that, but doctors, nurses, police officers, firefighters, all kinds of people will have been inconvenienced by this. It has knock-on effects, and as you say, the tube drivers, they're not poorly off in the grand scheme of how a lot of people are paid in London or across the rest of the country. So I do think, if we're going to talk about, for example, isn't it unfair that MPs get pay rises and stuff like that, you can't sit there and go, oh yes, but tube drivers, they absolutely do need better working conditions and more pay. I don't think it can be that people sit there and they say that, no, absolutely, that there's this one group that's very well paid relative to the rest of their industry, and they need even more encouragement, they need even more help, especially when it inconveniences quite so many people.
Andrew?
Well, transport workers worked hard over the pandemic, and many of them put themselves personally at risk. I do pay tribute to that. But the general point, I suppose, is restraint when it comes to pay awards. And I think that's important. We are facing a period probably of mounting inflation. We are going to be squeezed financially. The duty of the government, of course, is to put the wherewithal in place to encourage our economy to improve to the point that we are able to improve people's standards of living, their wage settlements and all the rest of it. So my point, I think, would be that we do need to exercise restraint and moderation when it comes to pay settlements. And I hope very much people will do that, tempting though it is, particularly as inflation gets a grip and people see the spending power of their wages and indeed their wage increases deteriorate over the next several months, probably a couple of years.
Well, I'll tell you the group of transport workers that I think deserve a pay rise after the pandemic is bus drivers, because their jobs were far more challenging, I think, than any other transport worker. Now people are going to text me in with loads of others that may have been more challenging, but bus drivers earn on average £25,000 a year compared to tube drivers, which, people can make up their own minds, which is the more difficult job. Andrew, Bill, Benedict, thank you very much for joining us. No one sent in a funny text question for the end. Maybe we've all been a bit too serious during the programme, so we'll have to forego that pleasure. Coming up in a moment, we're going to talk about Priti Patel and her revised proposals for Ukrainian refugees. Has she gone far enough now? 0345 6060 973. It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock. At least 5 people have been killed in an attack on a TV tower after Russia warned residents to leave Kyiv. Moscow says forces are preparing to target technology centres in the capital. A large convoy of armoured vehicles is also making its way